Hello and good morning, everyone. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. And today we start this festival season with another talk of Dr. Tushar Roy, the medico-legal expert we have with us since the last 1 month. Thank you very much, Dr. Tushar Roy. And thank you very much, Dr. Chanchal ma'am, the president of IMA South Delhi Branch, Honorary Secretary Dr. G.S. Grewal, the Honorary Secretary of IMA South Delhi Branch, and the Treasurer. All of us have been together for the last 1 month organizing these recurring medico-legal issues in daily practice. These webinars, I hope, have been of interest to everybody. So we look forward to another exciting talk today. We hand over to Dr. Chanchal Pal now. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Deepika. And at the outset, thank you for organizing this for us in such a flawless manner. Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. Greetings for New Year and Christmas. And it's heartening to see that you are joining us again, and already we have good number of participants and more are going to join. Today's episode is on safe practice, that is on medical legal issues, how to do safe practice and avoid any litigation in our practice. And today we'll be talking and discussing about communication and record keeping. Communication is very important. Most of us don't communicate properly, not only in our day-to-day life, also in medical practice. That's very, very important. And communication is two ways: listening and telling. Though I always say, listen and listen to the patient so that you can understand him. He also gets satisfied and you reach to proper diagnosis and understand patients better. And communication is telling also. Tell what you can do, what you can't do, what is happening. And even if it is negative, it's not your fault. The disease is there, so should not be hesitant in communication. Most of us have right intention. 99.9% doctor. I don't see any doctor who has bad intention, but we still become prey to litigation because sometimes we have not communicated properly. So they say communicate and document what you have communicated, and document what you have communicated, and communicate what you have documented. This is very, very important to save ourselves. Rest will be naturally told by our expert. And other thing is record keeping. Most of the time we fail to understand what record we have to keep, how long we have to keep, which format we have to keep, in digital or hard copies. So this all will be explained by our expert, which we have been listening of late. And I think we have hidden gem in our IMA South Delhi branch. And Dr. Tushar, हम आपको छोड़ेंगे नहीं. आप छुट्टी से वापस आएंगे, then again we'll catch you. And before I hand over mic to him, I'll just like to tell you that we do understand that there is a hangover after New Year celebrations. So that is why we are not keeping webinar on 1st January, which falls on Sunday. And the next webinar will be on 8th January, and that will be on waste management. We'll send you the detail. And with this, I welcome you all. I wish you a very safe and healthy New Year, and welcome you all on behalf of IMA South Delhi Branch. And I thank Dr. Tushar Roy for such working hard and telling us what to do, what not to do in our practice. And I also thank Jagsonpal, who will be continuing with us as a partner for such a flawless webinar. Dr. Tushar Roy, please. And let me tell you, Dr. Tushar Roy, as all of you must have understood, he's an eminent cardiologist. Not only cardiologist, he has been a legal expert because he's, apart from DM and MRCP, he's LLB also. Dr. Tushar Roy, please.
Thank you, Dr. Pal. Good morning, friends, and a Merry Christmas to you all. Next slide, please. So today we'll be talking about communication and record. So the first thing is, what is the object of communication? As many of us think that the main objective or the only objective of communication is the transfer of information. Although this is correct, the transferring information is what we strive for, but I believe one of the main reasons for communication is building of trust. The second misconception that we have, because all that we do, all that the doctors do is based on trust, because there is a big knowledge gap between what the patients know and what the doctors know. And therefore, establishment of this trust is the most important thing that in the doctor-patient relationship. Again, a misconception is that communication is that you have to talk and talk and talk. I totally agree with what Dr. Chanchal has just said, that actually the main idea of communication is listen and listen and listen. So this is listening, especially listening with empathy and communicating to the patient that you have heard what he has said. And this is called paraphrasing. So you tell back to the patient what the patient has told you in a slightly altered manner. This is called paraphrasing. And this establishes with the patient that you have listened to him very carefully. And of course, we have to explain everything. We have to explain the diagnosis. We have to explain the tests, why we are doing it, what the tests are. We have to explain the treatment. And also we have to explain the prognosis, whether it is good, bad, or whether it is good. Next slide, please. When we do this, when we do this correctly, the problem is correctly identified. The patient feels that because he has communicated everything that he has to say, he has communicated everything, the doctor has understood it because he's paraphrasing it back to him. So the patient feels very satisfied. The patient feels very understood. So when this feeling of satisfaction and that the doctor has understood what my feelings are, then the patient starts trusting the doctor, which I feel is one of the main objectives of communication. And when the patient starts to trust the doctor, the patient takes the treatment. And we know that when the patient takes the treatment with the belief that the doctor is doing best for him, then the patient gets better. When patient gets better, the litigation is much less. And of course, the doctor gets a great sense of fulfillment when he sees that his patient is doing so well. Next slide, please. So good communication, as Dr. Pal said, is the crux, is the cornerstone which prevents litigation. Even if something goes wrong, if the patient and the doctor has built a channel of communication and a channel of trust, then even if something goes wrong, there is hardly any litigation. This is lots of cases across the world where patients have said, "Chalo, ye hota hai. That's all right. He's a good doctor. He did not intend to do any of that." It is when communication breaks down that the patients then start thinking that about litigation. Of course, good communication, as I said, prevents litigation, but it is good records that actually save in case of litigation. So of course, we want to prevent litigation, but if it happens, it is the records that actually help us in the case of litigation. And it is said that a poor record is poor defense and no record is no defense. So it's very important whether you have documented, as Dr. Pal also said, that after you communicate, you have to document that you have communicated to the patient. So documentation is very important, because if it is not written, it is not done. So you have to prove that the things have been done and communicated, and for that, record keeping is most important. Next slide, please. So, of course, conveying of information to the patient is very important, but this conveying of information must not be in a purely technical manner. For example, I can say, as I said before in a previous seminar, that I can say the patient has occluded proximal LAD for which DES is required. Now, I've said everything very technical. I've said absolutely the correct thing. The patient has not understood a word of what I said. So I have to understand, I have to explain what is occluded, what is LAD, what is proximal, and what is a drug-eluting stent. So all these things have to be explained. So the explanation has to be in a manner in which the patient understands. And when the patient starts to understand and we listen to him and communicate, that starts building trust between the patient. And we use all of this to actually influence and persuade the patient into doing what we think is best for him. And I recommend some books very highly in this regard. And one is Dale Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People. That's very important, how to influence people, because at the end of it, we want them to do certain things. We influence them. We want to nudge them into doing a certain action, which we believe in the core of our hearts is good for the patient. The other book is Influence by Robert Cialdini, and then Nudge by Richard Thaler. So these are the three books, because we do not want to bang down our, what we want down the throats of the patient. what we want is like to nudge him in that direction, to guide him in that direction so that he takes the action on his own. Next slide, please. And many years ago in the late 1960s and early 1970s, one doctor in the University of California, Los Angeles, started working on what is communication. And he came up with this 7-38-55 rule. What that basically means is that the actual words communicate only 7%, only plays a part in 7% of the communication. 55%, a major part of it, these figures are not absolute, but the major part of it is non-verbal communication. What you do with the eyes, your body language, whether you're sitting across the table with your crossed across with your arms across your chest, or whether you gently put your hand on the shoulder of the patient, or gently touch the way you touch the patient when you examine the patient. All these create far more or convey far more information about your caring for the patient than any words that you maybe say. So eyes, facial expression, body language, posture, gestures. For example, I always stand, when the patient is an Indo patient, I always stand at the side of the attendant. So the patient is in the center. I don't put the bed in between the patient and myself. So if I'm not on one side, then the patient on the bed, then the attendant's on the other side. I'm always on the side of the attendant. This gesture itself conveys to me, it conveys to them that we are all in the same team and we are all working for the welfare of the patient. So non-verbal communication is one of the most important parts of communication generally. Verbal, of course, as I said, in verbal, the tone that you're using, the pitch that you're using, the speed at which you're using, sometimes we find that a grammatically incorrect speaker is far more convincing than a very grammatically correct speaker because of the emotion that he has put into the talk. You feel that this person is absolutely convinced about what he's saying. So it's the tone, it's the body language that conveys more than the actual words. Next slide, please. So obtain from the patients the perception of the problem, because we understand as we grow older and older, as we grow more experienced, we know when the patient walks in and starts uttering the first few sentences, we generally come to know what is generally wrong with the patient. We don't have to wait till the end of everything before we can actually understand or start understanding what is wrong with the patient. But this is not enough for the patient. As I said, the patient must feel that I have totally said what I have wanted to say, that the doctor has understood what I have wanted to say. Also, we must find out what is the physical, not only the physical, but also the emotional and social impact of the problem, so that we can heal the patient rather than treat the patient. And that is the objective, ultimately, of treating the patient. And the information should also be tailored to what the patient wants to know, not what the patient is actually asking. I will give an example. When we go to the hotel desk, for example, and we ask, airport kitna dur hai? How far is the airport? Actually, we are asking, technically, the distance to the airport. How far is the airport? But almost invariably, the reception will say, it will take 20 minutes. So what they say is that it will take 20 minutes for you to reach the airport, rather than actually answering your actual question that you asked, how far is the airport? So they are answering the intent of the question. They're not actually answering what exactly is the question. So similarly, when a patient asks something, often the patient is not really asking that question. Often there is an anxiety behind the asking of the question. So we must actually identify and address the anxiety behind the question rather than answering the question in a technical manner. And then, of course, we have to check whether the patient has understood what we have said or not. And the best way to do that is if you can ask the patient to kind of repeat what you have just told them. Next slide, please. So communication, especially in a need patient, has to be at least once a day by the senior consultant, and usually to the same person or persons. Normally, we find that in any group, there are one or two who are the decision makers in that group, in the attendance group. That may be the son or the daughter, or that may be the son-in-law or the daughter-in-law, for example. So after a couple of meetings, when we come to know who the decision maker is, we generally would like to communicate with the same person. We don't want person A to come on one day and B to come on another. Then the thread of that communication is lost. So we say that, okay, one or two of you come at this particular time when I will examine the patient and I will tell you in details or everything about the patient. So we communicate the status of the patient, what we are doing about it, what investigations we have done, what we are planning to do, what consultations we have taken in this regard and what the consultants have said, what the treatment we are going and what is the likely outcome of this treatment. And of course, as Dr. Paul said, that we must document this communication with the attendant. And we have in National Heart Institute a register, or in the file itself, we document that we have communicated. We have a sheet where it is written down that this has been told to the patient. And of course, the nurse countersigns that, so that we have documented that we have communicated. Next slide, please. So generally, in an email, of course, nowadays, many of us are communicating by email also. And email is one of the most important principles is that it should be kept short and simple, not complicated, not very long sentences. And then the second thing is that there should be what is called chunking. Chunking means that supposing you want to talk about, let us say he's got iron deficiency. So you talk about iron deficiency in one paragraph, then you keep a gap, and then you talk about vitamin D deficiency in the other paragraph, and so on and so forth, so that you kind of chunk these things and don't club them together into one big sentence or one big paragraph. That makes it easier for the patient to also understand what you have communicated, especially in email. The subject line should be quite explanatory, and whenever there is bad news or complicated information, this is better to communicate in person rather than by email. Next slide, please. So there are so many techniques of persuasion, and Monroe steps of persuasion is generally what is currently recommended. This is not only for medical communication, but any communication, especially corporate communication, where communication plays a very, very important role. And we will not go into any of these techniques, but just to identify a few. So attention, to get the attention of the person first before he can be persuaded. If the person is not paying attention, the person cannot be persuaded. And I'll just give a small example here. Many of you have experienced that when you're traveling in the car, the ISKCON person, they come and they give you a small flower, right? We've all seen that. We take the flower. He has immediately done two things, actually. He has grabbed your attention. And number two, he has invoked in you a psychological phenomena that is present in all human beings, and that is the phenomena of reciprocity. When somebody does a good to you, you naturally have an inclination to do good to them. So already the person, ISKCON person, has your attention. And then when he says that, okay, would you like to have a look at this book? And then you can't say no to that person. You have a look at this book, whether you intend to. And then subsequently they say, it's very cheap, it's very good. Would you like to buy it? So he's already got your attention, and he has invoked in you the psychological feeling of reciprocity. So after we get identification, we identify the need. So basically, many patients, they really don't need to know, or they're not really interested in the diagnosis and the treatment. They need to be reassured that everything will be all right. So we have to identify what exactly is the need of the patient and then satisfy that need of the patient. And then we can use certain visualization techniques and all that. Like, for example, there was this greatest car salesman in the world. He sold the maximum number of cars. And when asked what was his basic technique of selling so many cars, how could he sell on so many cars? He said, I always talked about the benefits and never about the features. I did not talk about the AC, that AC goes up to 30 degrees or whatever, 20 degrees or 18 degrees and so on and so forth. I never talked about that. I talked about the feeling you would get when you're sitting in that cool car when it is so hot outside. So he talked about the feelings. He talked about the benefits. So when we talk, we should also talk about the benefits. Supposing you put in this tent, for example, then you see you will be able to play the golf that you have stopped playing. So when we talk about the benefits, we satisfy their needs, and by using these visual techniques, and of course we nudge them into action. So this is a talk in itself, Monroe's steps of persuasion. So this is just a preliminary kind of idea as to what persuasion really, the steps to persuasion really are. Next slide, please. And this is not new. This started way back. Even Aristotle in the 300 BC used this particular technique, a persuasion technique, and he divided them into ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is who you are. For example, if you are a position of authority, you being a doctor, you are in a position of authority. So who you are, what is your background? Like I have MD, DM. So if I talk about cardiology, then people will generally have a tendency to take me on my face value because of the person that I am. Then, of course, emotion. When we play with the emotions, which politicians are very good at, or good speakers are very good at, they play with the emotions of the patient. So, asking them and to accept what he's saying, and of course, by using logic and data. I worked both in the United Kingdom as well as in India, and I found that there is a total difference in the patient population between the people who are there in the United Kingdom and people who are there in India. There, they are more swayed by logic rather than emotion. But here in India, emotion rules the key. We have to talk to them more in an emotional manner rather than more in a logical manner. So that is the basic difference between the Western population and the Indian population. We are very emotional people, and therefore, of course, pathos, that is emotion, plays a very, very big part in persuasion. Logic also plays a part, but a smaller part. Next slide, please. So these are the various persuasion techniques, as I said. So one is reciprocity, which I've already talked about. Authority, you being in a position of authority. Sometimes we feel that supposing there is a traffic jam, and we feel that policeman who's a constable, who is far, far junior to us in rank, in social status and rank, but when he comes and when he starts directing the traffic, we follow the rules absolutely implicitly. So because of this sense of authority, he's got that authority, so he can use those as a persuasion tool. So liking, if somebody likes you, if somebody develops a fondness for you, then of course they're more likely to do what you ask them to do. And of course, scarcity phenomena, for example, you obviously only 2 tickets left, only one book left, and so on. When you do that, then of course that acts as a persuasion technique. Of course, consistency and social proof. So these are again talks by itself. So I'm just hinting at the various techniques that one can use in persuasion. Next slide, please. So here is the problems. So what are the problems that come with communication? People is the problem. Process and systems are the problem, and the culture of the institute is the problem. What does that mean? For example, people is the problem, and of course, if you look at it overall, you always find that this goes back to the management, because training of the people is also a management function, and therefore ultimately it is the management that has to look at all these three: at the people, at the process and system, and as the culture of the institute. What do I mean? For example, a patient had died, and there was this nurse from Kerala, and within the earshot of attendance, she came up and said that body ko pack kar do. Now one of the attendants heard that. For the nurse, this was normal talk. I mean, this was nothing. She was from Kerala. She did not probably know the culture of the north, whatever. And when he uttered these words, there was a big chaos within the attendants, because body ko wrap kar do, body ko pack kar do. So these words, what the person has used, started immediately creating a huge problem in the and it had to be calmed down, and everything had to be done about it. But then training of the people as to how to communicate, who should communicate, how much should, for example, the nurse communicate, how much should the junior doctor communicate, and how much should the consultant who has been asked to advise on the patient, how much should they communicate. So all this is a talk in itself, and this is also the training that has to be done by the institute. Processes and systems, as I said, that in National Heart Institute, we have a page where we write down what has been told to the attendant, and the attendant then signs there. So this is the process and system that similarly become for records and for all the things. So processes and systems are also developed by the management of the institute. What is the culture of the institute? Yeah. Culture is something that is vaguely defined, but you can, for example, I can say that I'm working in National Heart Institute. So National Heart Institute has a very homely atmosphere, a homely culture. It's a very, when you go there, you can easily approach the doctor. You can, the guards are not that, dominating. They don't prevent it as much. So you can go up, you can meet the patient. So it's a kind of an open culture, a kind of a homely culture, as I would say. But the same thing cannot be said for certain corporate hospitals where the guard is very dominant, and nowhere it is very difficult to get at the doctor, very difficult to get past the guard, and so on and so forth. So that's the culture of the institute. Whether the institute has a culture of safety, culture of communication, that again is built up by the management. Next slide. Supposing something goes wrong, complication has occurred. The first thing that one must do is actually acknowledge that. One should not hide it. One should acknowledge that. But in our culture, apology is taken as fault. And therefore, do not apologize for this, but acknowledge the complication, explain what has happened, explain what you're doing about it, and what is the outcome that you expect out of this complication, what is the outcome that is expected, and of course, you must take specialist opinion if it so demands. Next slide, please. So complaints and conflicts may occur if the communication is not proper or conflicts are there, but this can be resolved before it blows up into a litigation. So complaints and conflicts usually occur when expectations are not met. So the patient has one expectation, the doctor did not know that the patient had that expectation, and therefore that becomes a conflict. That expectation could be on the level of service or a promise that the doctor had made which was not kept, and especially when no common goals were defined. For example, supposing many surgeons, I would say, say that this is a very minor procedure. Their body language says that this is a very minor procedure. Nothing there. But what happens is when, supposing under anesthesia, some problem occurs, when you say that it's a minor procedure and this body language of yours conveys that this is wind-shaped procedure, nothing will happen out of it. And when the problem occurs, then the expectation of the patient, which the body language said that nothing would happen, then they say, what happened? Why did this happen? And therefore, there is a discrepancy then occurs between what the patient expected and what actually happened, and this can give rise to conflicts. And no common goals. For example, I always set common goals. For example, we say this is our objective. This is finally what we will achieve. We will achieve that you will walk about, you will do your normal day-to-day activities quite comfortably, but you still, even after full treatment, you will not be able to run, you will not be able to do heavy activities after that. So we have set a common goal that this is what we are trying to achieve, or that I will control your sugars within the next 4 to 6 weeks. So he doesn't expect that the sugar will be controlled in the next 2 to 3 months. So common goals, if they are set, and the level of expectation, if we understand and we set those levels of expectation, then conflicts are unlikely to occur. Often when the conflict is there, often the patients just want to be heard. They just want you to comfortably hear them with empathy. They want to hear that the feelings that they have, the feelings that need to be acknowledged, that they need to be heard. And all they want really, most of the time, is a promise that it will not happen. There was a fault, somebody made a mistake, the process went wrong, and we'll take care of it. We can be very sure we'll take care of it, and it will not happen in the future. This often satisfied, and the conflicts do not go beyond that point. But supposing the conflict does. Next slide, please. And it has happened, and we have got together at National Heart and solved a few of these conflicts. So we call them to a nice, clean, well lighted room. Of course, all of us has to be on time. We greet and chat a little bit before we actually start the session. And there should be no disturbance during the session or the conversation when we are trying to do this conflict management. And of course, the senior doctor must chair the session. Generally, it's not the consultant who is involved, because the consultant then starts becoming emotionally involved in this conflict resolution, and that's not a good thing. So senior doctor with good communication skills has to chair the meeting. Next slide, please. So first of all, one must give a very sympathetic listening to the person without interruption. The most important thing is without interruption, because sometimes the patient will say things which are not true, or which in his or her perception was true, the attendance, his or her perception was true, but it was actually not true. And then the consultant or the junior doctor starts intervening. No, ye nahi hua tha. Do not allow that. So the person should be given a sympathetic hearing without any interruptions at all. Of course, to encourage that, one should make open-ended noises and ask questions. For example, uske baad kya hua? Acha fir kya hua? Or simple noise like, acha, oh, like that. So if you make those kind of noises and questions, then you continue hearing the patient in a very sympathetic manner. And this by itself lowers the level of anxiety and lowers the angst and the anger of the attendants. And then paraphrase them and let them know that you have heard and understood. So you paraphrase, the senior doctor paraphrases it back to them saying, okay, so this is what you actually told me in the last few minutes. And of course, be respectful to the person. Next slide. So the whole objective of this exercise is to find a mutual point of agreement, generally to get them in a yes mode. They come in a no mode, so you try to get them in a yes mode. Find points of agreement. Find points where both of you agree on a certain point, right? And then you can explore that point of this thing. Moments of silence during this period is quite okay. Next slide, please. So after all this is over, really ask them, how would you, okay, this has happened, so how would you like to solve the problem? And if the solution that they ask is quite reasonable, accept it. If they say that, you'll have to do this particular thing, or, the XOR has occurred, so you must nurse the person without cost, even if you have to come at home and nurse the person without cost. Okay, that's pretty reasonable. So you discharge the patient, send the nurse every day to this patient without any cost, and that solves the problem. Fair enough. But if the solution is unreasonable, give a counter offer that is reasonable. If they say that you have to give me so many lakhs of rupees and all that, you say no. We can't give you so many lakhs of rupees. We'll send a nurse at your home without cost, and every day she will come and she will look after it. And once in a while, a doctor will also visit to see how things are going on. This is a very reasonable offer, and most of them, they will take the offer. Next slide, please. So empathize with the patient, but do not patronize the patient. That is very irritating to the patient. So empathize, but not patronize. Be accommodating, but not compromising. Be assertive. So be assertive, but not arrogant. So these are very minor differences, but they make a huge difference. Persuade the patient, but do not manipulate. So nudge the patient, nudge the attendant into the direction that you need. Direct the conversation when the conversation is veering away to somewhere else. Direct the conversation without dominating the conversation. And of course, you can use the name of the attendant, but don't overdo it. don't too much do the name calling of the patient. Next slide, please. So here are the records. So that was as far as communication was concerned. We come to the records part. So in the records, of course, from the OPD basis, we have to keep the prescriptions. As I said, although the prescription, to keep the record of the prescription is not mandatory as per the law, but there was a letter from the Director General Health Service which said that it is better to keep the prescription, and from the legal point of view also it is better to keep your own prescriptions, because if you say that you have prescribed something, then you have to be the one that actually have to produce that prescription. So if there are certain requisition slips and medical certificate, yes. Now there's a new rule that is 1.3.3 in the ethics regulation of the Medical Council of India, and that says that you have to maintain a register of all the certificates that you have issued and why you have issued those certificates. And there is also a format in which the medical certificate has to be issued. And in that format, you have to ask the patient also to countersign the medical certificate and also give 1 or 2 points of marks of identification of the patient. So not only the patient's name, but a different identifier. For example, the signature of the patient has to be there. That identifies that specific patient. And also 2 marks of identification also has to be written in that medical certificate. A copy of the medical certificate must be kept with the doctor, and the medical certificate register must be maintained. So the medical certificate has to be in a sequential order. For example, this is medical certificate number 13/2022. So you maintain the register of the certificates that you issue. Next slide, please. How about the inpatients? So the inpatient records has to be contemporaneous. This is very important. So it has to be written at the same time that you are doing the thing. For example, you examine the patient and you write the record at a more or less the same time. You've done the operation, you write a short note in the operation. The full operative note can be added later on, but a short note immediately after the operation has to be written. Why? Because it gives a very much importance when a judge is looking at the paper. He or she knows that this has been written immediately afterwards. So it gives it a very good context. Because you did not know at that time what was going to happen in the future. So this was a record that you did immediately after doing something. So the date and time has to be mentioned. Date is important, but time is also now getting more and more important. So you have to mention the date and the time. Also, as I said, the nurse's note must support and corroborate what the doctor has written. So the nurse's note must not be discordant to the notes that has been written by the consultant, or the junior doctor's notes must not be discordant with what the senior doctor has written. So all the notes have to support and corroborate each other if a true story has to be built up. So write everything. Write the patient condition, what you're planning to do, even your thoughts and feelings about the future, and of course, any misbehavior or irrational request of the attendant. I was told that there are these standards now which they say that you must only write the medical things. I don't know from where they got this standard, because this is not a legal, this may be their procedural standard, but this is not a legal standard. In law, you can write whatever you want, your feelings you can write, misbehavior of the patient you can write, any irrational request. For example, they are asking to take thumb impression of this unconscious or semi-conscious patient on some paper, and I'm not allowing it. This has to be written on the file. There's no way that this must not be written. If somebody is asking for a thumb impression of a drowsy patient without the consent of the patient, this is an illegal act, and this has to be written down in the records. What the regulation standards are saying is immaterial. This is a legal standard. Next slide, please. And this has actually saved a group of doctors from Bombay in a very, very important case, the Anuradha Saha case. There's a whole bunch of doctors from Bombay were actually let go because of the kind of records that they kept. And in that, Dr. Uduwadia had written that, so many things regarding the patient's behavior and attendance. So about the records of the inpatient, at least writes once a day by the consultant and twice a day by the assistant in all cases. If the patient is critical, then the consultant must write twice a day on the record sheet. Whenever the situation changes, a record has to be kept. And the post-procedure, as I said, immediately after any procedure, after any surgery, you can write a small note immediately after, however tired you may be. And of course, a detailed report can be attached separately. That's not a problem. Next slide, please. The pages must be numbered. And daily detailed vitals and medication chart has to be kept. Consent forms have to be kept properly. Lab reports, radiology reports have to be kept properly. And of course, consulted notes that has to be kept properly, where you've asked for advice from other consultants. Next slide, please. It's the doctors who are responsible for writing the notes, but it is the hospital who is responsible for keeping the notes safely and confidentially. And confidentiality is there even after death of the patient. So after the death of the patient also, confidentiality, for example, you cannot openly talk about what is there in the records to any and everybody, even after the death of the patient. So confidentially continues even after the death of the patient. And of course, they must be protected from fire, protected from theft. And if you have an electronic medical record, which the recommendation is that slowly, everything should become an electronic medical record. If they are kept, then it is not that it is hacking proof. So somebody has not hacked into your system and downloaded all kinds of data, because that is a very personal data of utmost importance. So it is owned by the hospital. The records are owned by the hospital with some limitation. For example, when you own a property, there are so many things that you can or cannot do with the property, including destruction of the property. Whereas here, the hospital cannot destroy the record. So it is owned by the hospital, but the patient has a right to obtain a copy whenever they want. They can obtain a copy of the partial records, or they can obtain a copy of the whole record. It's totally a right of the patient to obtain a copy. Next slide. If there is any alteration, especially if there are any factual errors, you've written the age that is wrong. You've written the something else, which is wrong, and now you want to correct the factual error. You can do the factual error correction, but the method is that you must cut through the writing in one straight line, so that what you have cut through can be clearly read subsequent. So it must not be gola gola gola, just a plain straight line across that. So what you have cut through can be easily read, and then you can make the alteration above that or besides that, and then put your signature, and then put your date and time also why you made that alteration, so that subsequently one can very clearly know that you have made that alteration. And of course, there must not be any fabrication of records. So what about copy? So if the patient asks for a copy, as I said, of course, you must give the patient give the copy, and the copy has to be given within 72 hours. That is what is written in the ethics guidelines. Within 72 hours, you must give the copy. I'll tell you what all copies you can give. What about the relative? Well, for the relative, you must ask the consent of the patient. If the patient is an adult, and if the patient is of sound mind, then you cannot even give the records to the relative without the consent of the patient. So the patient has to write one word saying that please give the records to my father or my brother or my sister, whatever. And then you can, of course, go ahead and give it because you got the consent of the patient. But without the consent of the patient, you cannot give the medical records to even a close relative. How about the insurance company? Again, the same thing applies. You cannot expose the records to the insurance company without the consent of the patient. So the insurance company just can't walk in and you open the records to him. This is not done. You have to telephone the patient and ask them for their consent. Even an oral consent is okay. Insurance company has come. They want to see the records. Can I show it to them? If they say yes, go ahead and show it. But without the consent of the patient, you cannot give open the records for even inspection to the insurance company. What about police or court? Court, of course, no question. If there is a court order to give them a copy of the record, you must give them a copy of the record. There is no question. About the police, that can be varied. For example, why is the police wanting the record? So regarding police is a little bit difficult because sometimes the police, want it for some particular reason. If they want it for the benefit of the patient, fine. If they want it, for against the patient, something they want to do against the patient, then they must get a court order, a magistrate order before they see the record. So regarding police, it's a little complicated. If it is to help the patient, we found this patient. He was in a drunken state, and we want to know, what are the medical diseases so that we can take him to the proper doctor. Yes, then you can give the records. But if we say, we want to prosecute him because of that, then you say, okay, get me a magistrate order before you give them a copy or before you ask them to even inspect the medical records. How about disposal of the records? Well, first of all, if it is an electronic, if it is in the electronic form, it is better not to destroy it at all because it doesn't consume any space. The main problem with disposal is that it's consuming space. So basically, if it's an electronic medical record, then of course don't dispose it. But if it's a physical record, if it's a paper record, and you have not digitized it, then you can dispose of it. But generally, there are time limitations. I will talk about those time limitations of when you can dispose the record. And of course, how to dispose the record. You must always keep the face sheet and the main sheets, the face sheet and the diagnosis sheet, the discharge summary, all that must be kept. They must never be destroyed, but everything else can of course be destroyed after giving information in local newspaper, which one has to be in English and one has to be in the vernacular of the state, that you are about to destroy the records. And if anybody from this period to this period of time, if anybody wants to take a copy of the records, one can come to the hospital and take a copy of the records. So after doing that, one can destroy physical records. Next slide, please. So records, how long to keep in the OPD? As I said, there is no legal law by which it should be kept, but generally the recommendation is that you must keep it for at least 3 years since the last visit of the patient. So 3 years since the last visit of the patient, because the law of limitations says that action can be brought against anything that you have done up to 3 years after that action has occurred. So at least for 3 years, one should keep the, as I said, one should keep the medical register, the certificate register, the certificates, the prescriptions, and so on. In the inpatient, as I said, again, minimum period required is 3 years since the last visit, but generally the recommendation is 5 years. In case of child, it is actually till the child is 21 years of age. Till the child is 21 years of age. The reason being is that at the age of 18, the child then by himself can litigate, and 3 years of limitation are there, so up to 21 years. Up to 21 years of the, since the child becomes 21 years, you must keep the records of the child. In the medical legal case, till the medical legal case is finally disposed of. That means because they can go on appeal to higher and higher courts, till it is finally disposed of, the full medical records of an MLC case must be kept. Same thing applies, a similar thing applies for death. At the minimum period of 3 years, it has to be kept, but better, of course, to keep it for a 5-year period in a case of death. And even after that, one has to keep the face sheet, the discharge summary, or the death summary, and so on. And of course, if the case is under litigation, it is like the MLC case, where it has to be kept till the thing is finally disposed of. Next slide, please. So this is the format in the ethics guidelines, where this is the format for the medical record, or any of you can get it down, and this is how it should be kept. Generally, it is a face sheet that contains all these records. Next slide, please. So records, of course, once if the patient wants a record, the patient has to be given a record. The record generally what we give is the discharge summary, the main sheets, and so on and so forth. We don't give the copy of the whole thing, and this has to be given free of cost, and this has to be given within 72 hours. What I understand is, of course, that 72 working hours, not that you give it on a Saturday and you start counting 72 hours from a Saturday and Sunday. I believe it is 72 working hours, but what the law says, it is 72 hours. They don't mention whether it is working hours or not. And that is in the MCI regulations. It has to be given free of cost. But if they want the copy of everything, if they want copy of the doctor's notes, the consultant notes, the nurse's notes, everything, then that also has to be given. Again, it has to be given within 72 hours. But you can charge them at a reasonable price for the photocopying charges and so on and so forth. So the small information has to be given free of cost. But the major information, if they want the whole copy of the whole record, then of course you can ask for reasonable cost. What about the records by everything else? As I said, the legal heirs and the legal representative can be given, because now the patient is dead. Now there's a legal heir, of course, with proof that this person is a legal heir or a legal representative. On a court order, it has to be given, but everything else has to be done with the consent of the patient. Otherwise, even to a close relative, you cannot even ask them to inspect the record without the consent of the patient. Next slide, please. So before we conclude, so one must communicate well. As I said, listening with empathy is a most important part of communication. One of the major objects of communication is building up of trust, because it is on trust that we do everything that we do. This communicating well prevents litigation, it satisfies the patients, and of course, when the patients get well, it gives a sense of fulfillment to the doctor. So document well, it saves you in case of litigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tushar. Wonderful talk. And to imbibe everything, I think we'll have to listen to it again on the recording, since it's been recorded, it is on the Facebook. So I think we'll see it again and again, that how to understand everything. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Grewal for question answer, just one thing I want to clarify. That's you said confidentiality of the patient and the consent of the patient to giving record to the relatives. It's seen most of the time in corporate hospital, especially the evening time or late night, the attendant, anyone XYZ, is taking pics of your files. They ask for the file and they start taking pictures. And we sometimes we don't know how they are related, because patient doesn't designate one relative that he's to communicate. So how to go about it, because that also is a breach in confidentiality.
Yes, I totally agree with you. This is a breach of confidentiality. If you don't know about it, that's fine. But if you come to know about it, then it becomes your responsibility to tell them that this is not allowed. ask for a formal declaration. We will get it cleared by the patient, and then we will give you whatever the full copy. We will give it to you. Why are you taking it like this? Because this is not allowed, because you are breaching the confidentiality of the patient, and this is actually an illegal act, and it should not be done.
So we should not allow, because patient says we have right to information, so we should not allow them to take this photograph
unless the patient consents.
Okay.
If the patient says okay, unko de dijiye, then it's all right. Because our problem is that, are we giving this confidential information with the patient's consent or without the patient consent? We are not concerned that whether they are taking the picture or not. Is it with the consent of the patient or without the consent of the patient? If the patient consents, then they can go ahead and take copies of that. But if the patient does not consent, or we do not know the consent of the patient, we should say, just hold on, I will ask the patient. If the patient says yes, then you can go ahead and take a copy.
Okay.
Ultimately,
Sure. Tell me, Jack.
Yeah. So because ultimately it is the patient who has to say whether all the details regarding my medical thing can be given to person X or can be given to person Y.
Okay. And same is true for the insurance people, because sometimes they come and they start saying
Yeah, exactly. So we take it as a norm. Insurance to hai, to theek hai, unko, no. A small formality is that you must ask the patient that the insurance company has come. You don't have any problem if they see the papers. If they say no, I have no problem, okay. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say that nahi, hum nahi dikhayenge. In that case, they may stop the insurance, but that is not the hospital's concern. Whether the patient gets insurance or not is not the hospital's concern. So we have to follow our thing. So we have to only show the records in case of court order. In case it is in public interest or to save the patient, supposing he has some criminal intensity or a suicidal tendency, then of course we have to inform somebody. So in that case, where to help the patient, we can, in the public interest, for example, he has some kind of disease which he can spread. So in that case, in the public interest, we can disclose that without even the consent of the patient. So these are conditions which we can do. Regarding police, if the police wanted to help the patient, we can do it without the consent of the patient. If the police wants it to harm the patient, then of course we say get a magistrate order before we give it to you. But everybody else, whether it's a close relative and legal heirs, yes, legal heirs also, the patient is not there to consent, but we have to know that he's the legal heir. So somehow we have to prove that he's the legal heir. Only then we can, or legal representative, then we can do everything else. We have to give only with the consent of the patient.
So that comes to the point that sometimes for communicable disease, especially HIV, hepatitis and tuberculosis, patients insist that please don't mention in my record.
No.
So that has to be mentioned in spite of patients.
It has to be mentioned. Not it has to be mentioned if the regulation says that so and so maybe an open tuberculosis case has to be communicated to the authorities, it has to be communicated to the authorities.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Now over to Dr. G.S. Grewal, please, to take over the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chanchal and Dr. Tushar. That was wonderful. I mean, the simple thing of Marie se baat karna has so many connotations. I think 3 takeaways. First of all, paraphrasing is what you have conveyed, that when you listen to the patient and use your own words to talk what he has been saying, that is the first step that builds your trust. And as you said, it is important for the patient to get faith in you. Rest, what you do in treatment, he'll believe you. That is the important part. And one observation, Dr. Tushar, in India, we have a lot of problems when we don't have Hindi words for our disease names. Now, for example, inflammation of the intestine. अब इसको हिंदी में हम कहते हैं आंतरी में सूजन हो गई. So the moment they hear सूजन for them is, a swelling. अरे बाप रे, आंतरी में सूजन होगी. Now I have very difficulty in finding a good Hindi word for inflammation. And inflammation, you have an ultrasound report which says fluid in the abdomen. पेट में पानी हो गया. बाप रे बाप, the whole one of the challenges is how you convey it in a language that is not known to the patient and not known to you. So especially in your specialty, when somebody comes with a heart attack, you say heart attack हो गया. They'll say, जी heart attack क्या हो गया? So probably you have to go into the details of mentioning whether it is a pulse disorder or vascular. So again, the Hindi words play the role. नहीं वो नब्ज में है, वो नाड़ी में है, ये they get shocked because they don't know the anatomy. Anyway, can you invite Dr. Kalra, who had Mohan Kalra, who wanted to mention a few things?
Yes, sir. Very good morning. I'm really enriched by a very lucid talk by my friend Dr. Tushar Roy. I saw him. I didn't know that he is a barrister also, sir. So, sir, my point was when we document the recording or say the consent given or the explanation to the patient given that we have explained to him. My point is, if we keep a video record that we have given him the information in detail, otherwise at times they refuse to admit that I was told about the litigation, the complications. I was told it was a very simple procedure. They didn't tell me that patient can die also. So that way, isn't it
I
good
think,
to
Dr.
have...
Tushar, you had mentioned that video recording should be, what is your view about that?
Okay, so a couple of things. One is that negative things should also be written. For example, if a consent has not been given, then it should be written that consent asked for and or awaiting consent. For example, we had a problem in NHI in which there was a conflict between the doctor and the patient. The doctor said that immediately after angiography, I asked for consent. They did not give consent. And 2 days later, when they gave consent, I did the procedure. The patient then said that, if you had asked me for a consent, I would have given you immediately. You asked me 2 days later, and therefore I given it 2 days later. And the whole thing would have been resolved if only 2 things were mentioned in the record, that awaiting consent. Awaiting consent. Advised whatever, sending, awaiting consent. 4 words would have solved this problem. So negative, that not giving consent or awaiting consent, these negative things have also be done. Regarding video, for example, actually, it can actually be counterproductive. Why can video be counterproductive? The reason is that in the law, there are certain things you must follow. Let us say you have to follow these 6 points. Now, if you keep a video recording, you're likely to miss 1 or 2 of those points. If you miss 1 or 2 of those points, a clever lawyer will say that you did not say point number 5, and therefore this whole thing is not valid. And the court may go in that favor. That will not be there in a written this thing. In a written thing, everything will be written. For example, the complications, etc. Everything will be written down. So there's no question of missing anything out.
Safer.
Simple. So it's much safer. So I think it is not good for the doctors to have a video recording, because we are likely to miss certain points here and there, or convey. They may be thinking that they're conveying, but the tone and the body may be conveying something else. And therefore, they may point out that you did not convey the seriousness of the situation. Look at your body language.
And Dr. Tushar, you very rightly meant, Dr. Mohan, for, you see, the conveying to the patient that you are in control. Like Dr. Tushar said, in India, an apology is meant as though it is a mistake admitted. Now, therefore, it is useful to be on paper, and it is useful to be as minimal, clear words. Few words conveying your decision. Mohan Kalra, your next question, please.
My question one was to mention the time also when you are putting the progress reports.
Yes.
The date is not enough.
Very important.
Date is not enough, because in the same date you are seeing so many patients. Plus the overwriting part, overwriting I think is not a crime. If something was wrongly written, you overwrite it and put the time and signature again, that you have corrected it.
Overwriting can be accepted.
So about, sir, one more question, sir, about explaining the procedure and all that. I think now we have YouTube available. You can have something, some video recording of the procedure or something like that to be shown to the patient. That is
perfect.
Perfect. I do
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mohanji. Thank you. Your inputs are always welcome. So I think, yes, Anita ji, thank you. You enjoyed it, your presentation for the Christmas also. SCD, I don't know what Dr. Kiran Binayak wants to mention. SCD is told to patient by cardiologist. Is that all right? I think, Dr. Tushar?
Yeah. The STD, because STD, I understand sudden cardiac death, but the patient may not understand STD. As I said, saying things in a technical way is not enough. The patient must understand that okay, this is the problem. We have taken care of the heart failure. We have taken care of the heart failure problem, but his pumping efficiency is very poor. His pumping efficiency is now 28%, and therefore, suddenly he may die. You see. So instead of saying STD, you can say, he may just die suddenly, despite the fact that his heart failure is well controlled. And therefore, I think this special pacemaker, this ICD special pacemaker, needs to be implied.
That's all.
So then they have understood. They have kind of understood in a partial way. And then when you ask them, when they talk back to you, you come to know whether they have really understood what you have said or they have not understood it. And then you can convey it further. So something like that.
Right. So with any other questions, Dr. Padar or Dr. Sanjeev Sadeva, would you have any comments to make?
And thanks to Dr. Tushar, thanks to IMA South Delhi Branch for wonderful sessions you are doing. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Arora?
Thanks to all, advisor as well as speaker. I think all the consents to be taken in writing by anybody for anything. Tomorrow, anybody can deny and the burdens comes on the physician.
That's right. Dr. Tushar, it's been an absolute, I think the slides today were just for the first time anybody's seen them, because these slides are not the copy-paste slides available with the pharmaceutical companies where you can copy and paste them. So these were original. I must congratulate you and thank you for this wonderful presentation. We are being supported by an absolute flawless presentation with the help of Jagsonpal and Deepika Chavda personally. Thank you very much, Deepika. And for all the attendees who come, the 8th January will be a very, very important and interesting presentation on biomedical waste. So with these few words, I think, Dr. Chanchal, if there's nothing, let's close today's session and enjoy the Sunday and meet on 8th of January.
Thank you all, and wish you a very, very happy new year to all of you.
And thank you from Jagsonpal as well.